So thank you all for being patient with the technical difficulties. My process has a lot of different parts to it, and so I'm going to share little snippets of all these different parts. And I can go into depth further in any one of them, so you can feel free to stop me as I'm talking, or you can save your question for the end. Either way would be fine. But I'll give you kind of an overview of all the things. My computer has to be facing this way. Okay, so those of you that might not be familiar with my process, I do use text systems in my paintings. So what that means is that I'll take a text and translate it into painterly actions. The evolution of that process has changed quite a bit from the very first time I did it. So I'm showing this painting because it's the very first painting that I did this with. And what I did was I took my, I used to be a figurative painter, and that's what I did my MFA thesis show with. And when I first started this process, I took all of my MFA thesis show paintings and turned them into these abstract paintings by painting directly on top of them. So there's kind of this root of figure painting in all of my work, even though it's not really evident on the surface. This is the text piece on the left here. So what I used to do is that I would look for texts that were deliberately random. So I started with these pieces of paper that I found on the street. That's where it really started, because I was like, well, this is so interesting, because it just came to me, and like I didn't have anything to do with the origin of it. And those were the first few times that I used text. And then this one was, then I started like rolling dice to try to find a certain book on my bookshelf, and then a certain page, or the phone book. And so I was looking for something that I didn't choose, that I kind of left up to chance. And so these paintings started out as being kind of excited by and interested in chance. Although now it's evolved into something that's much more deliberate, which I'll share with you in a little bit. So then you can see in this one, so the reason that that I didn't actually write out the words of the text in this is because they didn't matter, right? Because they were random. And I was just looking for different elements of the text. I like this one because it's so clear what's happening. You can see there's different elements in the text that mean different things. So like if an E meant something, for example, oh, it's over here. It's off screen. Or a punctuation mark, or the end or the beginning of a sentence would mean something. And so I just marked those on this secondary piece of paper. And then as I would complete each step, I would mark it off on the paper. And so that's how this paper ended up getting covered with paint. So the way that this process actually worked is that I would take this figurative painting, which was large, it was 4 foot by 4 foot, and I put a 6-inch by 6-inch grid on top of it. And I just started with white paint. And I allowed the algorithm to tell me, or the system to tell me, how many times to concentrically go around each one of those grid sections until I stopped and found a shape inside of that grid section. So all of the white is me covering up the figurative painting underneath, and then all of the color is me exposing a moment of it. Some of them were altered, which you can see they ended up kind of flat. And the figure was a combination of a portrait and then a design, a pattern behind. And so the geometric shapes come from the pattern behind, and then all the organic shapes come from the figure. But you can there's actually a head here that you can start to see, and there's an eye and a mouth and some hair. Which if I didn't point them out, you wouldn't be able to see them. But by pointing them out, you can see that there really is a figure underneath here. It's just been completely taken out of context. And the algorithm was mostly just determining when I obliterated and when I exposed what was underneath, removing the figure elements from context in order to turn it into an abstract painting. So the really origin of this, which started back in my figure painting days, which I didn't realize was connected, is coming from when I was making patterns. So I got sick of trying to come up with complex ways to make patterns, because I was putting the figure in front of these patterns, and all I really cared about was the figure. I didn't want the patterns to take very long. So I realized if I just took one simple shape, so in this instance it's the grid shape of the square that's been divided into a dark and a light triangle. There's only 4 different possible orientations of that triangle, which you can label A, B, C, D. And then with one rule, which in this case, if you move down a row, everything scoots over to the left by 1 step. Just that one rule, you can have a complex pattern emerge. So I don't know if you can see it very well here, but there's this flower pattern on a stem that emerged that I didn't develop, right? It just came from one shape and one rule. And I like this as kind of like a metaphor for life, because we start off with these very simple parameters, and then complexity grows out of it in a way that we can't control or predict. And I just thought that that was really beautiful. So even though I'm using math, I actually think that is very much connected to humanity. I actually find humanity in this process all the time. And then I will say, since I'm talking about the fact that I'm using math, is that I was an art major and a math minor when I was in college. And so that's how I learned how to embrace my interest in logic and systems, even though the math that I'm using to make these is very simple. So if there are any like math people out there, you know more than I do. Okay, I don't know any more than the very basic math. I don't remember any of it from college, except for that I just know that my brain likes to think that way, and that I learned how to formalize that and integrate it into the main thing that I was doing. So I realized after I had been using this like cheat shortcut way to make these patterns, that there's actually a whole formalized system behind this that I didn't have to invent, right? I could just call upon it. And it's called, the one I was using was called Truchet tiling, which quilters use, if there's anybody familiar with quilting. And so they take the same set of circumstances, and then they can build these really complex quilt patterns without more than one or two simple rules. So then I started using, so I was calling them systems to begin with, but now I'm calling them algorithms. And I think that the nuance of that is coming from the idea that I have an input and an output, because I'm taking text and I'm turning it into a painting. So that's how an algorithm works. And I actually will sometimes draw diagrams that look just like this when I am trying to come up with how the painting is going to run its course. So the input for me is the text document, and the output are painterly actions that are based off of an abstract language that I just developed over time, right? So it is very compatible because they're both languages, right? One's just written, and one is a painterly language. But they do both have to be languages in order for them to connect. I think sometimes people are like, how could you possibly use math to make a painting? But it's the same idea, is that you just have to have these languages talk to each other. And then there's just a series of if-then statements that always result in an output, even if they meander around, right? So the if-then might be, if it's a consonant, then you make it white. If it's an E, then you expose an element from underneath, right? So those would be examples of rules that I would use. And then the complexity can just kind of build from there. So there was the time period where these paintings began with covering up my figurative paintings from grad school. And then I started making figurative paintings just to cover them up, because I'm insane. And after doing that a few times, I was like, what am I basically made 2 finished paintings. I also was coming up with all the compositions. I took all the photos myself for the figures, right? It was like, these are just 2 different people's work. I need to just not make this 2 different people's work. So there's this era where I have photos I can show you from, where I made the painting just to be covered up, so I have pictures of that process. But then afterwards, I started just making drawings from other people's paintings, which I'll show later. So there's not nearly as many interesting photos from that, so I'll just have to show you these older ones. So this is a finished early abstract painting. It's 5 feet tall. It's maybe 2017. And then this was one of the figured painting elements that was underneath that I made to cover up. And then you can see this contrast of the figure against the background. So I liked the geometric background and then the really organic figure. So that's why I kept using those 2 elements. And then here it is in process, where there were 2 figures. And really, the abstract elements are just starting to swallow the figure, right? They get cannibalized. And you can see that very much here. And then when you see a little moment like this connected to that, you're like, oh, they're toes, right? But then you see them in the painting, and you're just like, well, there's an abstract painting, right? So you can see how important the figurative painting is underneath for me, even though the viewer on the outside is not necessarily aware of it. This was also another era in my painting, which I call roadblock paintings. So I was still taking a 6-inch by 6-inch grid and covering up a large figurative painting with it. And then I still worked inside the confines of that grid, except for now the grid had roadblocks that were established through basically the negative shapes from the figurative image underneath. So I would go and block out the negative shapes. And then when I imposed a grid on top of that, the grid had to kind of squish and conform around the negative shape. And so that's why some of the grid sections are still squares, and some of them got distorted into these funny other shapes, but still sitting inside of a 6-inch by 6-inch parameter, right? So you can see that there's an evolution that still very much relates to this body of work. I am still using grids, even though they've gotten so transformed you're not really aware of them anymore, but this is the beginning of me transforming them. So here's another one where I started to get lazier, where I started only painting the part of the figure that was going to be exposed, and then the rest of it was just a drawing. You can see there's this figure here. And then in the center, there was mostly where the grid kept its integrity, because that's where the figure was, and so there wasn't negative space. And that's how we're able to have this kind of movement in. And you guys are also welcome to interrupt me with questions at any time. Okay, so then the next part of this was that I started taking text. Did you guys have a question?
I was just
you want me to go back?
This
yeah.
seems to be one of the first ones where you have these noticeable concentric geometric shapes, like in the lower left-hand corner here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, the concentric geometric shape is something, this word concentric is something that I do keep returning to. In this instance, it's enclosed, and so it envelops in on itself. And then in paintings like these, they start to echo out, and they look more like echoes. But it's the same idea of kind of repeating. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Okay, so then I started taking texts just through the process of working with language, which I had never really thought about before. It was something I kept on the back burner of all of my thoughts for most of my life. And then since I started working with language, I started noticing cultural documents of language that would make my blood boil with rage. I don't know if you have this experience at all. That I'm just like, this is wrong. This is not okay. And here is this document that is causing this impact, right? So sometimes they're official in that they are bills that are passed or bills that are denied, or lawsuits that were won, lawsuits that were lost. But sometimes they are even more cultural archives of like jingles from a commercial or children's books, like things that have a real impact on the culture in a way that I found to be really negative, that I felt powerless against. And this is really the trajectory that I'm on now, which it was very much related to what I'm using in this show. So my first act of taking these documents was that I just couldn't stand the language in them, and so what I did is I started to reorder all of the letters in there, right? So I'm taking this thing that's emotional and I'm making it super logical. And I'm just like, I'm gonna put all the A's at the beginning and then the B's and the C's and then the punctuations at the end. So I went sentence by sentence and did that. I did this by hand. There probably are I should say, I don't use computers at all. And there probably is a computer program that could do this in like half a second flat. Don't tell me about it. I don't even want to know. After I did this, I was like, oh, I bet there's a computer program. But there's something that's like a labor of love in it that allows me to like find my power, right? I'm like I'm physically, personally dismantling it. And I end up with this text that is like complete nonsense, right? So this one over here caused a ton of harm, lots of pain in its wake. This one over here, gibberish, right? I kind of saw this as a metaphor for this was like taking a gun and like moving around its parts. And so all the same parts were there, but it couldn't hurt anybody anymore, right? And I love this so much that I actually, the very peak of it, I took an 18-page document and single-handedly reordered all of the letters. I just put it in a Word document, and I was like, A, B, who knows how many hours. And I showed just that by itself in one kind of special show.
Each section is true to each other. So the number of A's on the right, for section 6, is equal to the number of A's in the original text on the left.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I'm making both illegible. So this one got illegible because it got covered up with paint as I was making the painting. And this one got illegible because I've reordered it. And so I also like that this has been silenced too, right? I destroyed it, yeah, exactly. So here's the painting that I made from it. I'm sorry, this is just a little bit off kilter. So this is another 5-foot painting that gets more complex towards the bottom. And so this was also the first time, so I'm still using the grid, only now I'm having different zones in the painting. And so in this series of paintings, I made it so that the bottom, each time I did a row, the row underneath it, if it interacted with the row on top, they had to connect. And so that's how you got things that like were bigger and bigger and bigger as we got towards the bottom. And that's a theme that I've carried forward into what I'm making today as well. And this painting just got purchased by SeaTac, so in the fall it will be up at the, I have, thank you. I have my friends here to thank for helping me know that I should apply for that. So in the fall that will be hanging up at SeaTac. It's also from 2018, maybe it's an older one, but I think it represents a big, important move in my art making. Okay. And then this one got more complex towards the center, and also had different zones in that certain shapes were allowed to be larger once they got towards the middle, right? So I didn't know that there was going to be this big curve shape and this big swirl shape here, but I did know that once I got towards the center, there would be a rule that said, find this shape and carry it across 3 different grid sections or whatever, right? So I could control that it was, that there was going to be a focal point in a certain location, and the contrast increased, right? But I could not control what it was going to look like, right? So there's this interesting collaboration between me, a control freak, who teaches and is like so steeped in the principles of design that like I would be boring if that was all I did, right? Because it's like it's such a predictable thing that then I give myself over to this algorithm process to allow some tension and strange and interesting and exciting things to happen that I don't have to rely on myself for because I'm never going to be able to do it, right? And so I truly see it as a collaboration where some things I can control and decide and get that kind of beauty and stability that I'm kind of craving from all of this schooling that I'm steeped in, but then also open it up to something that's kind of unbiased and strange and unpredictable.
So are the colors correlated with specific letters? I noticed when you destroy the original text, it looks like, that you're using different colors to destroy the original text. So is there like a correlation where like A is a certain color and all the B's are a certain color?
Yes. Okay. So I've been told I need to repeat the question for the microphone. So I'm going to repeat what you said, what you asked. So there was a question about, so that we can notice from the text that there are some really red parts on the text that are, then there's really red parts on the painting. So is there a correlation between moments in the text and then the moments in the painting on a letter-by-letter basis? Am I getting that right? Yeah. So yeah, and the answer is absolutely, right? So that's why I showed this one, because it shows so clearly how from top to bottom it's very low contrast, and then it starts to increase in contrast, and then there's these big sections of bright red and bright blue, just like from the outside in, right? So the text is following that same trajectory that the painting is following, and it's set up enough that you can probably find moments directly from the painting in the text, but it's convoluted enough that you couldn't do it completely, right? So there is some solvability to these, and then other kind of remaining mystery, just because the process is too meandering. It's not so straightforward, but very much so. And the reason that all of my brushstrokes to this day are discrete, they're unblended, right? They're like you could outline them, right, and pull them out like a sticker, is because they're the singular discrete element that the letters in the text are. And then the letters in the text accumulate to create a larger idea, just like the brushstrokes accumulate to create a larger picture. And so it's very much one-to-one. One letter in the text equals one brushstroke in the painting. And so if the painting is bigger, I need a longer text. Yeah.
And you talked about using randomness earlier. Is this a case where you consciously chose which colors associated with which letter, or was that part of a random process?
That's a good question. So I actually, throughout all of these processes, I always have the same color relationships to the letters that's actually based on synesthesia. Does anybody know what that is? Maybe we're an art audience, we've heard of that, right? And Kandinsky he was kind of famous for having synesthesia. He could hear his paintings. So I have it associated with letters and numbers have colors to me. And so I always make the letters the color that they are in my head. But in order to make paintings that have a bunch of different color environments to them, which you can easily point out in the room around you, I'll sometimes just categorize them into warm, cool, and neutral, so that, warm in the green painting might mean it's a little more yellowy green instead of actually red, right? So A's are always red, and in this painting, the A's are very much red. But in the green painting, it might just be a more warm green because it's in the warm category. Yeah. Okay, good questions. Thank you for asking. Okay. And then I showed this painting so you could see texture, but you don't need to see that because you can see them in real life. And then those are the the text, the unaltered text, where you can actually see some A's are circled and some E's. The A's and the E's are really important just because they show up so often, right? But sometimes I'll have like 26 letters and there's no E, and I'm like, what, right? And so there's this little bare patch in the painting, but like that's cool, right? Like I wouldn't have left that bare patch if I hadn't had made that rule. So I like that too. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little about color. Those of you that have been my students, I have a couple students, past students in here, you know that I talk a lot about color. And I very much practice what I preach. There's this great relationship between color research in my studio, and then how I bring that into my teaching in the classroom. And so when you look around, you'll see that all of the paintings have strong color identities. And that comes from the fact that I am systematizing color, which of course I would, right? Because I'm systematizing everything else. So it's coming from a color theory knowledge, but it's not the same thing as like textbook color theory. It's very much experiential color theory. And knowing how colors interact in the ways that they relate to each other. So here's a painting of me in my studio. I'm including this so you can see what my palette looks like. Anybody that has ever painted before, your palettes probably don't look like that, because I feel like I'm the only one who's crazy enough to do that. But you can see there's a color system to this, right, where I'm starting with this central red color, and then it gets warmer on this side, or it's cooler on this side, lighter towards the bottom, and then more desaturated here. And then I leave it like that, and I paint with it like that, right? And so it's like the color system that I develop on my palette is very much brought into the painting. And then they're related to elements of the text. And so the text does decide which colors go where, but I decide which colors exist at all, right? So I'm developing like the color environment. And I'm also deciding which colors are rare or high contrast. And then I can associate them with rare moments in the text, like a punctuation mark. So I can control it in some sense, but then sometimes I'll get a bunch of punctuation marks right in a row because it's like, there's like quotes and parentheses and whatnot. And then what I thought was rare becomes abundant. And so then I'll get these funny little moments that like there's a lot of contrast in moments where there's not. So now I started making these color systems that are a little bit different. And there's a better picture here. And all of these are paintings in the room. So this is the purple one over there, and this is the one on the other side of the wall. You can't see them very well, but anyway. The reason these had to change is because I stopped having one dominant color and I started having a gradient between two colors that then had these like high contrast offshoots, right? So I would figure out what the gradient was between the two colors, which there was always going to be two of them, and then what the accent colors were associated with that. So I always make these first, and then figure out the colors. And color is quite a strong reason to paint, really. I do think the two reasons that I paint are because I love color and because I want to be able to dismantle these texts that drive me crazy, right? Okay, and then I've included this one just because it's an interesting standout. It's the only time I've used something that wasn't a text as my input. I used a piece of sheet music. It was a special commission. It was John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme." And I was like, I could easily, when the person who had this commission idea asked me to do this, I was like, I knew I could do it because I knew that the notes are letters. Right? I don't know much about music, but I know that. So I was like, great, I could easily do that. But there's this really cool thing about music, or any sound, is that sound is measured in wavelengths, frequencies, and color is measured in wavelength frequencies. And so you can actually associate color and sound with each other in a way that feels like they're very much aligned by just combining their frequencies. So like up here, there's F that's purple, and somebody who's not me, I didn't figure this out, somebody figured out that the frequency of purple is vibrating at a similar frequency to the color, or to the sound of an F note. So I used that to help me figure out what each one of the notes would be doing in association with the palette. So it's the only time I didn't use the synesthesia connection. But then I also had all these different instruments to work with because there's not that many letters to work with. So then I had these different color spaces that the instruments occupied, and they all got filtered through yellow, right? So even though there's like a rainbow of the text elements, then they all had to get filtered through yellow in order to get the painting that looked like. Oh, wait. Well, okay. I'll show you the painting first because I've set up for it. Go. There we go. Looks like this. Okay. And then here's the sheet music where I had to mark off each note as I completed it. And then a little reminder to myself about what color the musical notes were because it was different than my normal system. And there's the painting. And then so I talked about the underpaintings with the earlier work with these figurative paintings that I had been making, and then that transformed into working with line drawings from already established artists who made good paintings that I didn't have to put together myself, right? That had a really big impact on this show, particularly. So I want to show you some of those. So this painting is not in this show, but they did start this process. So this is the underpainting from this painting. And if you see them side by side, you can definitely connect how they're influenced. I'm not inventing any of these organic shapes that are here. I'm not inventing any of them. They're all coming from this figurative painting underneath. And so the figurative painting underneath will have a profound impact on the design. And I made a design change in this one with these Diego Rivera lily paintings. There's a whole bunch of them. And I just liked that they kind of do this. And if you just look around, look at all these paintings that do that, right? It completely changed the design. Whereas my designs before this were kind of these kind of rolling cloud shapes. And then all of a sudden they became these like bouquet, right? So the Diego Rivera lily paintings had a really big impact on like at least half the paintings in this room. Because once I did it once, I kept doing it. So this brings me to this title, Beauty and Violence. There are two reasons that I titled it that. One is the visual result of some of these processes, I think can call it both, and then also the conceptual aspect of it. So this was the very first lily painting that gave me the idea, and it's titled Beauty and Violence. It was the first painting that did this that then became the show title, and that's that one right there. So you can see it more easily. So after I made it with the lilies, I didn't know this was going to happen. I was surprised when I stood back and realized that it looked like a bouquet of flowers, which it is, right, in some sense, but it also looked like a mushroom cloud. And I loved that because it kind of brought me back to this humanity of nothing is all good or all bad, and nothing is all love or all hate. Nothing is all good or all evil. And this painting is both, right? It's both violent and it's beautiful. And so I just brought up the mushroom cloud and the bouquet of flowers. You can see how similar they are in their structure, yeah.
So these paintings, did you just not use text in this process?
Oh, I did. Yeah, so there's both. Both is happening in all of these. So all of the shapes come from the figure drawing underneath, and all of the decisions about when the shapes occur, how big they are, and what color they are come from the text. Okay. So all paintings have both, right? This is where it's like, I could spend 5 hours just talking about what I do. Like the more questions you ask, the more you'll find out. Yeah, so the text, yeah. Oh, I use a grid on my phone. I would never let my students do this. I don't want to even say it out loud. Don't listen to me. Yeah, you guys are done. Yeah, I'm lazy about it. Sometimes I use a projector, but I didn't think that's too much work. So I just take the picture on my phone and I grid it, and then I'll grid the painting. The painting's already gridded, so it's easy to do that. And then I'll just do a simple drawing from there, because it doesn't have to be good, right? It almost is random. I could make random scribbles, almost, right? But I need the specificity of them, so it couldn't be random scribbles, but they don't have to make sense or look good, right, in themselves. So I'm pretty lazy about it. And there's not really worth taking pictures because you can't really see them in the pictures. It's so light. Yeah, so that's why I don't have any to share with you today. Yeah. Okay, then the other structural thing that I thought lined up well with the show title was the ones that don't look like mushroom clouds or bouquets do have this explosion out from the center, which could be seen as an explosion of joy. Right? Like I think that one's kind of joyful. It almost looks like confetti, right? It's kind of leaping around, but it also could look like an explosion of destruction, right? And so, yeah, I just think it's really great that these paintings have both in them, because I think that that's how life is as well. There's another exploding one, you know that. Okay, and then there's this last little conceptual piece of the text elements where, so I told you I was using texts that just like I thought were causing harm in the world in some way. And the ones that I did for this show kind of all had this connection where there was violent language in them. And So I stopped completely covering up the text and started exposing some violent words. And then those violent words, I called them keywords, and they would mean something in the painting. So, like in this painting, the keyword would have some sort of high contrast breaking away from the rest of the order. So anywhere you see a high contrast moment, so this text is for that painting over there. Anytime you see a high contrast moment in the painting, it came from a keyword, and it's the number of letters of the keyword is how wide it is, how many brushstrokes it is, and the colors, the synesthesia colors of the keyword as well, right? So they're really important in the painting, and I started exposing them and leaving them in the text. And then I ended up with this poem, this kind of violent poem. And I actually think this will be the future of my work. I need to get more of them. I don't have a good enough to make like a series of them yet, because they're a very special kind of text. But it seemed just right. So there's violence in the language that's built into the structure of these paintings. But I don't want you to think that means that these paintings are representing something bad. I actually think that they represent something really hopeful. So this is my last slide, is this peacock. So what I'm showing you the peacock for is that they are known to deliberately eat plants that are poisonous to them in order to build up immunity. And people say that the poisonous plants are actually the reason why their plumage gets so colorful. And so it feels like a perfect metaphor. I don't know scientifically if that's true or not, but it seems like the perfect metaphor for what I'm doing, which is that I'm taking something that I think is poisonous and I'm turning it into something colorful and beautiful through this act of transformation. So I think that these paintings are about joy and empowerment and hope, even though I'm starting from this place of kind of a disillusionment with the world that I'd like to change.